Man, I woke in a sweat at 2:10 a.m., heard the soft creak of Ava's daughter door, and my chest dropped like someone slammed it shut. I moved like a man who has practiced calm 100 times and failed once, every step heavy and loud in my own ears, and I could hear him breathing in the dark before I saw him. Logan's son was bent over her bed with his hand under her pink comforter, whispering like it was a lullaby turned poison. He said, "SHH, remember, if you tell, Daddy will get sicker," like he was reminding her of a secret we should all keep. I didn't think. I didn't plan, I just moved. I grabbed his arm hard and dragged him away as if I could pull the sky off his shoulders. He stumbled, slapping the floor with his knee and then catching himself, face flipping from surprise into something I could not name but knew to fear. He looked smaller and colder, like a person who'd been someone else until the wrong hour turned him into a threat. I remember the sound of his breath and the way the hallway light made his eyes shine weird. I scooped Ava up without asking, without breath, dialed 911 with shaking fingers, and shoved us into the locked bedroom while he began to pound on the door behind us like he could knock the whole house apart and get back in. That minute stretched until it felt like a day. Ava's heartbeat thudded against my chest like a second, softer drum. "Daddy," she whispered, voice thin and raw, and I kept picturing her bruises, dark as dried fruit, the ones the doctors once shrugged off as maybe and unlikely until the pieces fit like a map. I held her like I could keep the world from finding the line where she wasn't safe. Outside the door, Logan's fists hit wood and he muttered things under his breath that made my blood run cold. "You promised," he said over and over, but it was not to her, it was to himself. When the dispatcher came on the line, it felt absurdly calm, like a tether to someplace sane. I told her what was happening and she said, "Help is on the way." I told her I had him here, that he was in the hall, that I needed them now, and I kept repeating those words until sirens cut through the night like scissors. I remember telling the operator not to let them talk to my kid, and I remember hearing the distant crunch of boots on gravel and feeling like I could breathe just a little. They arrived quick enough that my brain couldn't work out the time. Lights flashed blue and red down the street, and a squad walked up my driveway like they knew what they were carrying in their hands. A young officer with a badge that gleamed asked me to step aside, and a detective with a voice like gravel took over, telling me to sit until they checked the house. I watched them move through this place that used to be simple and ordinary and feel like a map of every small kindness I'd ever done, all of which now seemed to have led to this moment. They put Logan in cuffs in the front room. He didn't resist much. His face had gone somewhere past rage into a blank I couldn't read. The paramedics came to check on Ava even though she said she was okay, and when the nurse asked simple questions, her answers came in small pieces that made my stomach drop. "Does it hurt? Where does it hurt?" they asked, and she would point to places I had seen but had refused to name out loud. I watched their professional calm, and it steadied me when everything else was hollow. The officers told me not to sleep, not to close my eyes, and to sit with my daughter until they finished. "You're safe now," one of them said, and for a sliver of a second I believed him. They took Logan downstairs for questioning, and I sat at the kitchen table and tried to remember if I'd ever missed anything obvious. If there had been a sign I had misplaced because I was too tired, because I worked nights, because I thought my job was feeding us. My hands kept finding bruise photos on my phone, old ones, faint, the edges of memory, and I started to count Wednesdays like a man counting pills. How many nights had I been gone when I thought I was keeping us afloat? How many times had someone else stepped in and used that gap? My brain went back over every small favor he'd ever done, teaching her to take her pills like it was care, staying late to cook because I had double shifts, sitting up reading because I was in the hospital even if only for tests. All the little thoughtful things now looked like rehearsals. They took statements, wrote down names, and asked me to explain things I'd avoided saying out loud. I told them about the bruises I'd tried to photograph, the nights I'd left the video camera on a charge and found the footage empty or truncated, the searches that had shown up on shared devices. They listened without blinking, and sometimes their faces made it feel less like I was losing my mind. A detective named Marcus said he would get a warrant and asked me to hand over any devices. I handed them over like I was giving pieces of proof and losing pieces of my family at the same time. When they led Logan out in the cruiser, he looked at me for a second that felt like a blow. He mouthed something I couldn't hear and his eyes were flat. I felt like a man ripped open and sewn back together wrong. Ava slept a little in my arms on the couch, safe for the first time in who knew how long, and I let myself finally breathe. The house was quiet then, sirens fading away, and I kept thinking about that whisper in her room, the lie that threatened my life to keep her quiet, and about how fragile the line between ordinary and monstrous can be when you trust the wrong person with your kid. Man, the ER hit me like a wave, bright and clinical and moving too fast for the kind of hurt I felt. Nurse Rachel led us to a small room painted soft like someone thought color could fix fear. I remember the smell of antiseptic and the hum of machines, the way my hands wouldn't stop rubbing at each other like they were trying to erase fingerprints. A doctor came in quick, calm, asking the routine questions in a voice that sounded like it had carried 1,000 scares. I answered with half words until the doctor leaned closer and said something I already feared. Those bruises match an adult grip pattern. Hearing it out loud made the years of small, stubborn doubts line up into a shape I couldn't deny. I had been tracking those faint marks on Ava's thighs for months, photographing them on my phone at odd hours, making notes about the dates. Each time I thought I was being paranoid, each time the doctor had shrugged, offering theories about fragile skin or clumsy play. But this time the bruise pattern wasn't random. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. The doctor pointed at the photos on my phone and said the shape and spacing were consistent with a firm, adult hold. I felt like I could see a map where there had only been dots before. Detective Marcus, asked me to sit down and tell him everything I knew in a voice that kept me from collapsing. He sat across the room and looked tired in a way that felt honest. He asked for the timeline, and I began like I had rehearsed in 1,000 sleepless hours, starting with the Wednesdays I worked late. I told him how the marks would show up on Thursday mornings, how they looked freshest then, like someone had been there the night before. I told him about the photos I'd taken, and the times I'd tried to set up cameras that came back with corrupted files or footage that had gaps I couldn't explain. I told Marcus about all the small things Logan's son did that had made me trust him with Ava. He'd cook low-salt dinners for her because of her liver condition, he'd pack her meds in labeled bags, he'd read until she fell asleep. He'd hover in a way that used to feel caring, and I told Marcus how that hovering had become a cover I hadn't known to read as danger. He always seemed so dependable, I said, and the words tasted like betrayal in my mouth. Marcus didn't flinch. He wrote down dates and times, his pen moving quick. He asked for the phones and the cameras and my calendar, and I handed them over like I was cutting out a piece of my life to give the truth a place to sit. They called in a child advocate while the ER finished its shift. A woman who introduced herself gently and said, "We will make sure she doesn't have to repeat this." And for the first time since that night, a thin line of relief threaded through me. The forensic nurse did a more detailed exam later, and I watched through a kind of detached horror as professionals did their work, taking samples and documenting each mark as evidence. They spoke in medical terms I half understood, and in the end told me their findings would disappear into reports and lab results that would either prove what I feared or leave me holding a pile of unanswered questions. I went over the weeks in my head as they ran labs and pulled footage from devices. I remembered the Thursdays specifically, how Ava would wake with the freshest bruises, how he'd tuck blankets just so, change a TV channel, leave a door cracked so it looked like he was being careful, almost theatrical in his concern. On the recordings I had salvaged, Logan played the role of doting brother perfectly, checking her pulse like a nurse, wiping her face like a parent. He'd touch her arm, smile at the camera, and then the timestamps would show blank spaces that I couldn't explain until Marcus's team started to piece together alarms set on certain nights and notes in a little black notebook I had once noticed on the kitchen table and thought little of. One of the nurses said quietly, "We see this pattern more than anyone wants to admit," and the way she said it made me angry in a new way, not just at what had happened, but at how I had been blind. How easy it had been to excuse the signs because I wanted to believe our home was safe. I thought of every missed call, every late night at the warehouse, every time I told myself that work was the problem and that our family would be all right if I kept going. Now the tally of Wednesdays and the sequence of bruises looked like proof of something deliberate, not accidental. Marcus asked me about internet searches and the shared tablet we used to find recipes and check medication instructions. I told him about odd queries I had found, phrases that didn't belong on a teenager's browser history, searches about how to avoid leaving DNA or tamper with timestamps. He looked at me as if he'd expected to find that kind of thing and then put it in his notebook with a steady hand. The forensic team said they could recover deleted data and pull metadata from photos. They said things like, "We'll preserve chain of custody," and "We'll subpoena the devices," and each phrase felt like a rope thrown toward something solid. When they finally left the ER with orders for follow-up, they told me to lock phones, to keep logs, to get Ava into a child trauma therapist as soon as possible. I agreed to everything because there was no moment when I could tell them I didn't want to know what the truth would make me do next. On the street outside, the night had gone pale and thin like paper, and I held Ava in my arms while thinking about how many Wednesdays we'd lost and how many more we'd get if we could get this right. The bruise patterns were no longer mysteries. They were a roadmap I would follow until the end. Man, I remember the knock soft, careful like someone who knew how loud my life had already been. 2 days later, Sela's child protective worker stood in my doorway with a folder and a steady voice, and everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. He talked me through a safety plan, change the locks, get a new alarm code, make sure Ava's bedroom door had a proper lock, and keep a list of everyone who was allowed near the house. He handed me a sheet that said things in blunt lines. Emergency contacts, safe rooms, what to do if Logan tried to return. I nodded like a man who wanted to do everything right and felt hollow, because a home plan felt more like a map to survive a war than a checklist for a family. Silas got to work while I watched from the hallway as if I were watching someone take apart a part of me. He and a locksmith changed the locks and reset codes while I boxed up Logan's things. Packing his clothes felt like closing a book I hadn't known was burning. I pulled shirts off hangers, rolled socks into neat pairs, and every little thing I wrapped felt like evidence and accusation. I felt like I was losing the ground beneath me, like the world I'd been walking on had turned to wet cardboard. "We have to do this now," Silas said, patient but firm, and I did it because the house needed to be safe for my daughter more than it needed to be whole. The hospital call confirming the forensic exam came that afternoon like a cold wind through an open window. The doctor told me gently but clearly that the exam confirmed repeated sexual abuse and injuries matching the grip patterns we'd been documenting. The words formed in my head like glass, clear, sharp, and impossible to unsee. I remember the doctor explaining the findings slowly, like he was feeding me something too heavy to swallow, and I had to keep asking him to repeat things until they stuck. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "These injuries are consistent with force, and we documented evidence of repeated trauma." I felt my knees go weak and had to sit down on the kitchen floor while Ava colored at the table, smiling at something on her paper like she didn't know the house had an ache in it. Detective Marcus called after the hospital. He told me they had enough to proceed with a formal investigation and that they would be securing digital evidence and interviewing people who might know. He sounded methodical and tired, like a man who had carried too many of these nights and knew the habit of staying calm to get things done. "He's denying it," Marcus said, and for the first time I heard the word denial like a slap. Logan said it wasn't true, that this was a mistake, that something else explained the marks. Marcus told me to keep a log of everything and promised they would move as carefully and quickly as possible. Shortly after, Logan's lawyer called, cold, practiced, and predictably defensive. He suggested I might be misreading medical signs and that Ava's autoimmune cholangitis could explain the bruising. I listened to the lawyer try to reframe our fear into a clinical note like he could erase the pattern with a better diagnosis, and it felt like someone was trying to muddy a river I was trying to follow to its source. "Medical conditions can cause bruising," the lawyer said, and the words were a gauntlet thrown at me to make me doubt the road I'd been walking. My anger rose so fast it hurt. I wanted to scream at the man, to tell him what I'd seen with my own eyes, how I'd found photos, how the bruises always showed up after my Wednesday shifts, how recorded evidence had fills and gaps that didn't add up to accident. Instead, I told them I'd cooperate and hung up shaking. Rage and helplessness collided inside me in a way that knocked the breath out of my days. I felt fury toward Logan that was raw and animal, and a panic that hissed like steam when I thought of what Ava had endured. At the same time, a small, practical voice told me to lock doors, to back up footage, to call the hospital for copies of reports. I did those things like a man learning to perform a ritual he never wanted to need. I protected evidence, sent photos and notes to Marcus, and kept an iron record of dates and times because the only way forward felt like building a cage of facts around a feeling that otherwise might evaporate. There were moments of quiet that cut the loudest, Ava humming to herself while we waited for test results, me lying awake at night counting Wednesdays like a man counting reasons to hold on. Sometimes I caught myself staring at Logan's empty room, imagining the worst and then shaking it away because I had to be present for Ava. I went to a support meeting where Carmen, support group leader, spoke and other parents shared words that landed like stones in a pond, making ripples that steadied me. They told me the rage was normal and the exhaustion expected. That didn't soothe the ache, but it made me feel less alone. In the days that followed, we tightened every corner of our life with quiet measures. We changed routines, asked friends to call before arriving, and made sure Ava always had someone with her when I couldn't be there. I learned how determined I could be when the safety of the little person in my arms depended on each choice. I also learned how hard it was to trust the world again. The house was safer in a way that mattered, and the lawyer's words couldn't erase the evidence that was already turning into a paper trail. That trail was all I had to keep us safe and to find some justice for the damage done. Man, I sat in a small monitoring room and watched Ava's daughter through a screen, the picture grainy but everything else crystal clear in my head. The interviewer, gentle and steady, introduced as a specialist, sat with her in a brighter room, a pile of dolls and figures on the table, and my chest felt like a fist. I had rehearsed what I would do if she said something else, had imagined denial and confusion. But when she whispered the first words, I knew the long months of doubt had snapped into one terrible truth. The interviewer asked simple questions in a low voice, the kind that seemed meant to help a child find words without being pressured. Can you tell me about things that have hurt you? She said, and Ava looked down at the dolls for a second like she was getting ready to tell a secret she had been carrying for too long. She whispered bad touches, as if the phrase itself was heavy. The room on the screen felt small and safe and wrong all at once, and I pressed my hands together until my knuckles ached so I could not reach through glass and pull her into my arms. They used dolls like the doctors had suggested, and the interviewer asked Ava to show what had happened. She moved the dolls slowly, one doll on the bed, one holding legs, and her small motions were precise enough to make my throat close. When asked how long this had been going on, she lifted her hand and counted 6 fingers before the interviewer repeated the question, and she confirmed 6 months. I did the math in my head, folding each month into the Wednesdays I had worked at the hospital, the nights I'd been away thinking I was doing right by them all. The weight of those missed hours felt like a lead vest. Ava's voice was small when she explained the nights. When Daddy left for work, she said, he would come and hold me down. He would tell me not to tell because Daddy would get sicker. The words were exactly the ones Logan had used that night, and hearing them come from her mouth made my stomach twist into corners I didn't know existed. She showed with the dolls how the brother-son would hold her legs down on Wednesday nights after I left. The motions were simple, unimaginative, and the pain in them was the most honest thing in the room. I kept my eyes on the screen because I couldn't bear to look away, and I couldn't bear to look directly at her either. The recording went on and the interviewer counted details gently, asking about times, places, and words Logan used. Ava described alarms and a calendar with crosses and how he told her to be quiet. Her small voice sometimes broke and she would look up as if trying to read my face through the one-way glass. I wanted to walk over and tell her she didn't have to explain it anymore, that I already knew. But I stayed put because the professionals said not to interrupt, and because they were building a legal record with every sentence she gave. When the recording ended, they let me go into the room like someone unlocking a door I'd been trapped behind. She fell into my arms and sobbed, the sound like something that had been waiting years to leave. I held her while she cried and smelled the clean kid scent of her hair and felt the damp of tears on my shirt. "Daddy," she said between hiccups, "I'm sorry." I told her there was nothing to be sorry for, that she had done everything right by telling, and she squeezed me like she was trying to push me into her heart so I would not leave again. The interviewer and a child advocate explained what had happened in careful, slow sentences. The recording, the way the nurse and doctor had documented the injuries, and how Ava had counted months and used the dolls to show what had happened. They told me this would be part of the evidence and that it would spare her from testifying in court if possible. I felt relief at that fact and guilt for feeling relief, but the thought of her having to tell all that in front of strangers or in a courtroom made my stomach churn with dread. They said the next steps were reports, forensics, and meeting with the detective to go over the recording and the findings. Walking back to the hall felt like moving through fog. I kept thinking about the gap between a child and an adult who should protect them, and how someone you raise can hide the worst of themselves behind the smile of an attentive brother. There was also a strange, dull gratitude to the professionals who made the space, and the process gentle enough for a kid to speak. The recording was the clearest, most heartbreaking confirmation of what I'd feared and had been trying to prove for months. And now the truth sat between us like a living thing we had to learn to live with. We left the center with instructions, a list of support people, and a plan to keep Ava away from all things that might hurt her again. I clung to the list like a lifeline and promised her we would make it right. The promise felt enormous and terrifying, but I could see in her small jaw, in the way she held my hand, that hope had room to grow again if I stayed the course. Man, I remember when Marcus, detective, called and said, "We found stuff," like a man handing you a match in a dark room. I felt like something inside me folded up sharp and loud at once. Forensics had dug deeper than I dared to imagine, and each new piece felt like a hammer on a wall I'd been trying to pretend was solid. Marcus talked me through the findings slowly, the way you talk to someone who needs to hear facts before they can breathe. He told me they recovered deleted browser searches from Logan's son's computer and phone, and I could hear the words even before he finished. "Searches about keeping children quiet, avoiding evidence, preventing physical signs," he said, and my hands went cold. The phrases on the screen were things no one should ever type, things you only imagine in the worst scenes of movies. Seeing it in print made the whole pattern real in a way photos alone hadn't. I pictured the searches like fingerprints on a glass window, impossible to hide once someone turned a light on. Marcus also said they pulled metadata from photos Logan had said were taken at Grandma's wife's mother's house. The timestamps didn't match Logan's story. They were taken hours earlier, Marcus told me. He claimed they were from tonight to build an alibi. The thought of him constructing a fake story with photos, staging calm while he planned harm felt like guts twisting. I remembered seeing him smile in footage, checking blankets, and pretending to be the perfect guy. And now those smiles sat next to a trail of lies and careful timing. Later, when I found the black notebook at home hidden under a pile of old mail, the pages confirmed the pattern in handwriting that made my stomach drop. The notebook had dates and small notes, and Wednesdays were circled in red with little marks next to them like tally marks. There were notes about my work schedule, times I fell asleep, when I left for the hospital, and even reminders labeled quiet. Seeing my own life mapped like a schedule to be exploited felt like a betrayal so big I couldn't name it. I flipped through pages with shaking fingers, reading entries that looked like someone had practiced cruelty as a plan. There were other details that stitched the picture tighter. Marcus told me about alarms found set on certain nights and then turned off at exact times. There were notes about how to answer if asked, scripts for being concerned, and practice lines written down about helping with meds. It read like someone rehearsing for a role he wanted to play until it became reality. The planning was relentless and cold, a steady, patient thing that had used our ordinary life as its stage. I thought back to the small theater he'd created, cooking low-salt meals, reminding Ava's daughter about pills, reading bedtime stories. Those acts had looked like care, and I had thanked him in my head so many times for stepping up. Now they felt staged, tools to build trust so he could move when I walked away. Each piece of evidence changed the memory of him into something I couldn't recognize. I grieved not just for what he'd done to Ava, but for the person he'd pretended to be in front of our family. Marcus arranged for a forensic tech to demonstrate how they recovered deleted files and metadata, and I watched screens light up with fragments that told a story better than any one photo did. He showed me recovered search queries and the timeline they had created from devices. He said, "It's a pattern, it's planned." Hearing that line gave me a strange clarity and a new kind of anger, a sharp, focused drive to make sure none of this was ignored or explained away. When the news reached Logan's lawyer, there was a flurry of calls and denials, predictable and fierce. The lawyer argued the searches could mean nothing, that metadata could be edited, that notes might be misread. I listened to the attempts to muddy the facts and felt a practical coldness set in. I started photographing everything in the house, backing up files, and making copies of the notebook pages. Marcus helped me organize the evidence into a timeline so the story couldn't be smeared into confusion. There were nights I couldn't sleep because the pattern played in my head like a looping video. I saw the crosses on his calendar, the alarms, the checklist of how to act concerned, and I felt both rage and a fierce need to protect Ava by making sure the truth couldn't be buried. The more forensics pulled up, the less room there was for doubt. The evidence laid out the plan like blueprints. Someone had thought this out, tried to cover tracks, and used the gaps in my life to hurt my child. That truth landed on me like a weight, but it also gave me a path forward. One built of facts, witnesses, and the stubborn refusal to let the pattern be erased. Man, the courtroom talk hit like a rainstorm you can't shelter from. I sat with my hands folded so hard they ached. Prosecutor met me once and said straight away, "Trials can re-traumatize kids, we have to think about her safety first." Her voice was calm, but there was steel under it. I wanted justice that would scream, but she kept bringing us back to what Ava needed most: protection and a life that didn't revolve around courtrooms and testimony. The thought of Ava on a stand made bile rise in my throat, and Alina's steadiness felt like a lifeline at the same time it narrowed our options. The defense lawyer called often and tried to paint holes large enough to drive doubt through. He said calmly, "Injuries can come from medical issues, your diagnosis could explain bruising," like he was offering a kinder, cleaner explanation to make this easier for everyone else. I felt my anger flare each time he said it, hot and animal, because I'd watched the pattern and seen the planning. He was always so helpful, so attentive, the lawyer argued, and I wanted to throw the notebook at him, to show the red circles on Wednesdays and the scripts written in his hand. Instead, I stayed quiet, because Alina warned me that a fight in public could hurt Ava more than it would help. Alina walked me through the evidence like a map and how it fit together: Ava's recorded interview at the Child Advocacy Center, the forensic exam, the recovered metadata showing photos with falsified timestamps, the deleted searches about hiding evidence, the black notebook with my schedule marked, and DNA evidence tied to the injuries. She said, "It isn't a single piece, it's a pattern." Hearing it said that way made the case feel less like a messy argument and more like the truth lined up in a row. I remember Marcus, detective, leaning over the folders with a look that said he'd seen this before, and we'd done well collecting what mattered. Child Protective Services tightened our safety net in stages, bringing in therapy, victim services, and home modifications to make sure Ava wouldn't be exposed again. Sela's child protective worker checked in and said things like, "We will make arrangements so she can feel safe at home." And he set us up with a therapist and a schedule for follow-ups. There were people who called and picked up groceries and who taught me to lock patterns and keep logs. Those practical supports made space for the hard work, soothing Ava, getting her medical care, and helping her learn to trust again. Each phone call was another small brick in rebuilding a sense of safety. When the plea was on the table, Alina explained why it might be best for Ava to avoid a drawn-out trial. "We can protect her from being re-traumatized and still get a meaningful sentence," she told me, folding her hands on the table. The defense pushed hard, trying to make the forensic results look uncertain and the interview open to interpretation. They called into question medical causes and tried to suggest that behaviors were misread. I remember thinking their cold practice at spinning doubt was almost artful in how it tried to erase what I'd seen. But the stack of evidence made their attempts look like reach instead of reason. We took the plea because I kept seeing Ava's face when I imagined trial testimony. The way she counted 6 months with her small fingers, the way she cried into my shirt after the recording. The agreement read like a cruel compromise and a mercy at once. Logan's son would go to juvenile detention until 21, then be on probation for 10 years, register as a sex offender for life, and have a permanent no-contact order with Ava until she turned 25. It felt like someone had put a bandage on a deep wound, necessary, but not the same as fixing what was torn. I told Alina I accepted because the alternative risked making my kid tell everything all over again. My relief after the plea was immediate and strange, like breathing through a lung that had been partially collapsed for months. Yet it was incomplete. Some part of me kept expecting the clock to rewind or the lawyer to find some new loophole and take it all back. I grieved for the loss of the son I thought I knew and for the childhood he threw away, whether through choice or sickness of some kind. At the same time, I felt a fierce gratitude for the professionals who had kept Ava's needs first. Marcus, Alina, Sela's nurse Rachel, and the therapists who began the slow work of repair. We walked out of court with order papers and a plan, and for the first time in months I let myself hope in small ways. The plea kept Ava from testifying, which felt like shelter, and the protections meant she wouldn't have to relive it in a room full of strangers. But I still carry an ache that justice was only partial, that the sentence wouldn't erase what happened. I promised myself quiet and raw to keep building our life around small victories, therapy sessions kept, karate lessons started, nights where she could sleep without waking, and to make the case work for the one thing I wanted most: her safety and a chance for her to grow without the shadow that had haunted our home. Man, I remember the first night she came home from the hospital after they pinned her enzyme levels down, and the air in the car felt like a fragile thing we had to carry without breaking. Ava's daughter had been admitted when her liver enzymes spiked from stress. Doctors said trauma can do that, and they adjusted her meds and watched her closely until things calmed. I sat in a plastic chair that smelled like disinfectant and tried to feel grateful for every set of steady hands that had kept her alive, while a dull anger simmered under everything about how avoidable this had been. The medical team became a map I learned to read fast. Dr. Bennett, hepatologist, explained the changes in simple terms and told me what to watch for, and Nurse Rachel checked vitals like a ritual that kept panic at bay. They taught me how stress could push her liver into dangerous territory and how stabilizing her mind helped stabilize her body. When her numbers came down, we all breathed. When they spiked again, I learned how to sit through the monitoring without letting my fear turn into a shout. Each adjustment and medication felt like a tiny stitch, and I watched those stitches hold as she slowly steadied. Therapy started with Nolan, child trauma therapist, who used play therapy so Ava could lead the work at her own speed. Nolan set up toys and drawings and let her choose how to tell the story on her terms. At first she refused to speak about certain nights, but she would draw superheroes and then little by little add scenes where someone helped instead of hurt. Nolan taught me how to ask gentle questions and how to keep my face calm when her drawings pulled up old images. It was small progress, messy and imperfect, but it was hers and that mattered the most. Small victories piled up like quiet crumbs of proof that healing could happen. Once she smiled in a bright playroom while coloring and I felt my whole chest unclench. Another night she slept through the whole Wednesday without nightmares for the first time in months. Those nights were rare at first, but they grew in number. She joined an art club at school where a teacher let her test new paints, and I watched her come home with a paper full of bold lines and color that looked like someone trying on joy. Each of those things was a way of reclaiming the parts of childhood the abuse had tried to take. Sila's child protective worker kept checking in until he closed the CPS case months later, and when he closed it, it felt like someone finally turned a card face up in a long, dangerous game. Closing the case didn't mean forgetting what happened. It meant the formal emergency had passed and we could keep working on the life under the paperwork. Victim compensation came through in time to help pay for therapy sessions, which kept the work going even when money felt tight. The money didn't fix scars, but it kept the professionals in place who helped Ava learn to trust her body and other people again. We moved across town to a house that didn't belong to those old corners, and that move was more than boxes and a new address. It was a chance to sleep in rooms that didn't echo with whispers of the past. Packing up Logan's old shirts felt strange and necessary, but opening the door to a new neighborhood felt like permission to try. We signed Ava up for karate because the instructor assured me the focus and discipline would help her build confidence. And when she earned her first yellow belt, I cried in the parking lot like an idiot. Those classes taught her a physical way to feel strong and helped replace some of the helplessness she had been carrying. Night routines became sacred instead of rushed. I learned to watch for signs of stress in her small habits, chewing a sleeve, skipping a favorite snack, and to call the therapist before the worry turned into a spiral. Sometimes I still wake in a sweat on random nights, hearing the echo of footsteps, and my chest tightens until I remind myself we are far from that house now. The vigilance never really leaves me. It's a part of being a dad after what happened. But the nights I can sleep through without stopping are growing, and she has more mornings where she gets out of bed with ideas about painting or a school project. Those mornings are everything. We built a slow rhythm: therapy, medical check-ins, karate classes, art club, and days that feel mostly ordinary. The past sits with us like an old bruise you touch to remember it healed, and sometimes I still feel a stab of grief for the son I lost in the choices he made or the sickness that turned him into something else. Mostly now I carry a different weight: responsibility and relentless attention to the small, present things that keep Ava safe and let her grow. Recovery is our day-to-day, and while it will always be work, it is also where hope lives, quiet, steady, and stubborn as a sunrise. Man, I remember the morning 2 years later when I stopped counting wounds and started counting small proofs that we were okay, enough to breathe without panic. Ava's daughter was at the kitchen table with paint all over her fingers, smiling at a piece of paper that read "After the storm" in messy letters, and the sight hit me like a quiet, small miracle. The bruise marks on my chest from those first nights were still there in a different shape, less raw, more a line of memory. But watching her paint felt like seeing the beginning of a life that could be more than the bad nights that had followed us. She had a yellow belt now, folded neatly into its bag like a ribbon I'd once thought impossible. I watched her practice a kick in the driveway, the motion smooth and deliberate, and I thought about how karate gave her a way to feel strong in her body again. "Look, Daddy," she shouted once, wind in her hair, and the laugh that followed was a sound I had been aching to hear without an edge of fear underneath. Sleepovers came slowly at first and then more often, and I saw her come home with stories about new friends who liked her drawings and her sense of humor. Detective Marcus, detective, still called sometimes to update me on Logan's son probation terms and compliance, and his voice on the phone was steady like it had been from the start. He told me Logan had entered adult probation under supervision and that there were regular check-ins, GPS monitoring, and strict no-contact rules. Hearing that made a deep part of my chest unclench, not because punishment fixes everything, but because there were real barriers keeping us from repeating what had happened. "We're watching him," Marcus said once, and his words felt like a guardrail for our small, fragile life. Our safety felt like it came from a crowd of people who refused to let us fall. Nurse Rachel Nurse still checked Ava's med list on calls and reminded me which signs to watch for, and Dr. Bennett, hepatologist, kept adjusting meds with a surgeon's calm. Prosecutor Alina, prosecutor, called once to ask how Ava was doing and to remind me that the system had worked in a small, painful way. Victim advocate Amara, victim advocate, arranged resources when we needed them, and Nalan, child trauma therapist, kept guiding Ava through the kinds of play therapy that let her own sense of safety grow back. Each professional felt like a plank in the bridge we were rebuilding. There were nights when the past crept in, sudden memories or the outline of an old house that felt like a trap, but friends from the parents' support group, led by Carmen, support group leader, would call or show up with a casserole and a look that said, "We get it." That network kept us practical: rides to appointments, extra meals, someone to sit with Ava when a test made her nervous. Their presence taught me that recovery isn't a straight line, but a messy neighborhood where people hold doors open for each other. I didn't expect to fall in love again, but I did slowly and carefully with James' partner, another parent survivor who knew the language of quiet recovery. We met at a support meeting, traded small truths, and learned to fit our lives together without rushing anything. James had kids of his own and a careful way of listening that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't since everything fell apart. We built a safe home together, a place where toys didn't echo and where bedtime meant stories, and a calm ritual instead of locked doors and lists of emergency contacts. Watching Ava blow out candles at her 9th birthday with James and our blended crew around her felt like proof that healing, while fragile and slow, was real. Kids who loved her sang loud and messy, some of them from school club and some from the dojo, and she smiled like a person who had learned to expect good things. I felt a strange combination of gratitude and sorrow, grateful for the people who helped, sorry for the parts of childhood that were stolen. But the candles snuffed out a little of the shadow that had sat over us for so long. 2 years on, the scabs were still there in places no one could see and some scars would never fade, but everyday rhythms replaced dread. Art club on Tuesdays, karate on Thursdays, therapy and check-ins that felt as normal as brushing teeth. I still kept backups of evidence and stayed on guard in ways a parent never fully drops, but the vigilance had a different texture now, less panic, more steady attention. I could sit in a yard on a warm afternoon and not hear a phantom knock at the door, and that was a kind of freedom I hadn't thought possible. I tell the story now because the path from that first night to this one was not a straight march to a finish line. It was a long list of small acts that added up. The people who helped, Marcus, Nurse Rachel, Dr. Bennett, Prosecutor Alina, Amara, Nolan, Silas, and friends, were the scaffolding that let us rebuild. James joined us in that scaffold, steady and practical and gentle. As Ava hands me a new painting with bright colors and a crooked rainbow, I hold it like evidence that we can mend without erasing what happened, and that the life we stitch together can hold joy again. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.